This is the Real Impact Podcast. I've recorded this, I'm going to say close to 200 times now. Had different takes where I've either not said the right thing, it didn't sound good, a bunch of different things happened. Over the last 4 months, I've been trying to get this up and happening. Amongst moving house, being in a space that's not super conducive to sound, and then figuring out some different microphone types and stuff like that that work better with my voice. Hopefully, finally, we're there. So last night, I was out to dinner with my partner, and we sort of do this thing where, when we go out for a dinner, we've got these question cards that are sort of prompts for conversations. And one of the questions that came up was around, like, what's an area that you're sort of holding back on at the moment, or where's someone you're not taking action on? And the thing that I spoke about was this little podcast project that I've been talking about for a really long time. I've kind of got all of the stuff set up for it, but I just haven't taken that final step of, I suppose, publicizing it or putting out some clips, and a couple of different factors at play. So I thought I'd open up a little bit to talk about some of that on, what I've reflected on today, thinking about some of the lessons learned or reflections I've had over the last 4 months. Then a little bit about, like, why I've even started to, create this and why I want to create a podcast. And that sort of connects into a little bit of my lessons learned. And then I'll just talk a little bit about sort of what my plans are, what my hopes are for this, and some of the topics that you can probably expect to hear me talk about. So the couple of topics that came up last night. So I think the first one, generally, putting anything out there like this that sort of feels like it's it's recorded, it's out on the internet forever, is a degree of sort of perfectionism, I suppose, and just sort of wanting everything to sound right, feel right. All of the things I talk about, be sort of perfectly structured and all of those things. I think the reality is that that's not going to happen because of how many times I've tried to do that so far. It's quite hard to sit here and talk to yourself about yourself. Is probably another hard thing about the process. And there's definitely a degree of, I suppose, imposter syndrome that creeps into that, where, you start to kind of go, well, am I even saying anything interesting? Who's even going to want to listen to it? Am I going to go to all this effort and post it up and it gets 3 views, and one being from my partner, one being from my mum, and one being me checking to make sure it actually sounds good this time. So, those thoughts sort of creep in as well. But then I was thinking back on that today, and I think to some degree what I have thought about is that even when I was talking about the reason why I'm starting it, didn't really feel me, didn't feel authentic to myself. And even talking about my kind of story about how I got into L&D in the first episode I'd published, didn't feel like I was really being, completely myself in a way. Because I think, in the corporate world, there is a part where we, have a slight mask on, or at least a personality that is our professional work personality. So I'm going to try and find the balance where on this podcast I can be myself. Obviously, it is professionally based, but still make sure I, am truly myself whenever I talk about things. So for the last, say, 10, 12 years, since really about probably 2011 or so, I've been on a bit of a journey of changing my life, and in many ways have done a complete 180 from the kind of lifestyle I was living and way I was living my life. And even professionally, I think I was, very lost in sort of what I wanted to do or where I wanted to be. And, a lot of things changed in my life around that period. My father actually passed away in 2011 and really made me sort of look at what I was doing with my life. And, at that time, I didn't really have a lot of people, and in all of these different aspects that I've really spent that time, trying to evolve in my life around sort of health and wellness and fitness and my professional life, my relationships, all of those things. I didn't really have, I'll say mentors around me or people in my immediate circle that could support me with those things. So books and podcasts and, have been my primary source of a lot of that. I've been really then fortunate in the professional space over the last, I'd say maybe even 5 years or so, that my external network's grown, and things like LinkedIn really allow now a much easier way to talk and connect to people, as well as getting invited along to sort of industry events and sort of leader forums, and even last year then getting to talk on some panels and things like that. You get much more exposure to peers and to people, and to start to kind of then be able to have some really rich discussions. So podcasts have been such a huge, incredible part of that growth for me. And I found myself over the last couple of years, having some conversations with people and thinking afterwards, like, oh, I wish I could have just recorded that, either for later, to share with my team at work. Like I've talked to some of my team members about some of the conversations I've had with people, and I've said to them, oh, I was talking to this person about this thing the other day. Like, oh, I wish I could have recorded it and sent it to you, because there were some really valuable things that relate to this sort of challenge you're trying to solve, or this thing that we're talking about now. And the amount of times in my week I generally talk about that, of like, oh, there was this podcast I was listening to, or you should listen to this, is massive in my week. So some of those things were really, I started to think about, setting up a podcast, starting this. I think that, just generally conversations with people have been a big feature of my life as well. I'm genuinely very curious about people and a bunch of other things in the world. And I really value human connection and conversation, and getting to know people deeper. So even in the professional sense, I do a lot of external sort of connecting with people, and just reaching out and chatting with people, Zoom, like Teams calls, or just, generally getting to know people outside of the walls of, the company that I work in. I think there's so much value in bringing the outside in, that you can start to look at other ways that people have overcome, challenges that you're trying to solve, or even to challenge your own perceptions and ideas about particular things. So all of those things. And then end of last year in December, I got an invite to speak on a Brendan Hall panel in January. And the person that was coordinating that, she'd reached out and asked me, have you got a link to your website, or, blog or podcast, or et cetera, that I can put in your bio for this panel. And I didn't have a link to any of those things. I've got a link to my LinkedIn, but, ultimately I was on the panel as, Greg Woulfe from the company I work at. And everyone else I was sharing that with were, had their own thing that they could point to, their own body of work, their own sort of voice outside of the company they work for. And so that was sort of the final trigger, I suppose, where I went, okay, I think it's time for me to bite the bullet, to do this thing, to sort of, have intentional conversations with people. There's a bunch of books, L&D books that I'm reading at the moment, where I'm interested in the people behind the pages and the people behind the podcast I listen to. So, that's something I'm looking forward to and excited about doing with this, is being able to have an excuse, or an ability to connect with some of those people, have conversations, and then ultimately expand the access to them. In Australia, there is already some L&D podcasts. Probably the most prominent one that I listen to is Michelle Ocker's Learning Uncut podcast. Really great podcast, and goes through, essentially each episode is sort of going through someone's case study, essentially, of a problem they solved, a thing they've done, which is a really amazing format, and I've learned so much from them. So that's, I think that it can't hurt to have more voices, and it can't hurt to have more people represented in Australia on podcasts, and being able to sort of expand and amplify our network here, as well as taking, voices from overseas and people, and expanding their access to people in Australia as well. Because I'm still really surprised at some of the people that now I've become, I suppose, very aware of, and I think their work is super valuable. I talk to people in L&D in Australia, and that haven't heard of some of these, I'd say really prominent names, or the work that they do. So there's obviously still plenty more that we can do here to make sure people are heard, people have access to people, and like I said, I think there's a part where, I'm just genuinely interested in being able to sit down and have some conversations with some of those people. So I'll talk a little bit about my story about how I got into learning, because most people, it's completely by accident. But when I sort of look back at the elements now that really make up who I am professionally and what I'm interested in, there's threads that expand back through my whole life that really tie into that now, which I think contribute massively to what I do. I always say to people, that I just so happen to apply my skill set to learning, not that learning was my skill set. So growing up, I was incredibly interested by technology. I was, a geek, computer game kid when I was younger. Learnt web design, learnt how to do HTML coding by myself, started to learn software design at school. All of those things were really interesting to me. That was ultimately the path that I wanted to head down. Life events took me in a different direction, and I won't go too in depth into that right now, but ultimately I got thrown off that path, and then later in life I ended up sort of in a management role and ended up picking up on basically setting up a e-com business and managing a whole online business for a more bricks and mortar traditional business chain. So I went from there to then I was living in Japan for 6 months. I came back to Australia, and some of my best friends had all started to work in the mines at the time and kept asking me or begging me to go and work up there. And the number one selling point was the money is great. And that was tempting, but I really enjoyed what I did at the time, and the thought of doing 12-hour night shifts in the dark wasn't particularly interesting to me. And so I ended up applying for the job anyway. I caved in eventually and thought I'd give it a go, or at least throw my name in the hat, because it was, at the time, fairly hard to get into as an industry. But I put my name in. I ultimately got the role as a trainee truck driver in the mines. And then the classroom or 2 week sort of induction experience was really then the gateway drug into L&D for me. And really, in that first day, sitting back and seeing people in the classroom struggling with the format. There was people I talked to that said how hard it was to sort of concentrate and learn. They hadn't been in a classroom for 20 years since school. This was all sort of, maybe average age was sort of 30 to 40-year-old men in this classroom of about 20 people. And, talking to some of those people and just observing the challenges people were having in that environment started to just make me think about, that the struggles they were having and what could be done differently, what could be done better. And just my mind kind of, wandering off into some of those things while I was in that classroom. So, on the first day, there's a funny little story that I have around the mine manager came to our classroom, to welcome us as new starters. And at the end of the first day, he came and did his little talk and then asked if there was any questions. And we'd already been warned he was a bit of a hothead, kind of keep our head down, don't ask too many difficult questions. I put my hand up and asked him and said, Paul, thanks for the opportunity, and I'm really interested in how I become something more than a truck driver. And he kind of smirked and laughed and went, you just worry about being the best truck driver you can. And once you finish your traineeship, then come and see me and we can talk about that question. Didn't kind of think anything more of that conversation at the time, but went about, like with everything I do, I like to think that I put my best effort into it. I went out and coming back to the classroom. So before I go to the truck driving side of it, on the second, third day of the classroom, I went up to the guy that was facilitating it after seeing him struggle through broken links, broken videos, presentations not working, files that were broken. He had all sorts of issues going on, slides that weren't updated because rules had changed, whatever the issues were. And I went up to him and just offered him. I said, look, I've come from kind of IT computer kind of background. Like, I'd be happy to help out if you want a hand. And he initially said no to me. And then he came back to me, I think, the day later and said, look, I was thinking about your offer and I'd really love you to come and give me a hand with it. And so I started to come in early mornings, hang around in the afternoons before and after the class, and just started to work through, like, updating the slides for him, fixing the links, doing all the stuff for him. which evolved a little bit into me starting to adjust some of his content, because there was, very, if you just imagine just walls of text, death by PowerPoint type presentations. This guy was quite animated, funny guy, heaps of stories, animated guy that had been in the mines for like 40 years, slightly inappropriate, and yeah, a bit of a character. But so I started to kind of ask him when I was going through the slides, I'm like, what are you trying to say with this slide here? What's the message you're trying to get across? Like, I had no idea. Now I'd probably call that, I suppose, learning experience design, or, at least instructional design kind of work, saying, hey, what's the key message on this? And then just focusing the content on that. I was thinking about it more from, I suppose, the principles I'd learned from web design and keeping pages simple and some of those sort of design principles, but it all carries over. So that's probably the first thread that kind of came into that curiosity in the classroom, offering to help, but looking at it from probably the tech sort of lens and thinking, okay, I think I can help there. But then, just through sort of the conversations we had, I started to, now look back and go really improving on the content that he had. So did that over the 2 weeks. He came to me at the end of that 2 weeks and was really happy with. He came and said to me, like, we've gotten through the content quicker, so we can go out in the mine driving around. We can spend the last day out in the mine. And he was really surprised that he felt like he'd told people less, but they remembered more. Was a comment that he made. So that really stuck with me. It was interesting. It was great. I, felt good for being able to help out. But same thing again, kind of, went out and did my thing on a truck. Spent 12 months doing that. Did what the mine manager at the time had told me: go out, be the best truck driver you can. And around the 12-month mark, I'd actually won Trainer of the Year award. So, I was, probably because I was doing so much overtime, I was working like 70-hour weeks, almost double what the normal roster was. So I had some stuff up my sleeve. I spent twice as much time out there than a lot of other people. So I think I got a lot more experience, a lot more exposure. And then because of that, I got picked out as there was 5 truck drivers that got picked for this sort of driving efficiency project. Now, same thing again, this was another probably learning job before I even knew anything about learning jobs. Was I basically had to jump up in trucks with other people that were doing the job that I was typically doing and do some coaching. And it wasn't about content. It wasn't, a learning module. It wasn't pages of theory they had to read. It was just me jumping up, looking at what they were doing, finding sort of areas of performance and pieces that they could do to do better. Sort of develop my own system of hints or little sort of ways of explaining things, because everyone sort of almost had a different style of driving. And based on that, I had different sort of coaching tips that I could use, and sort of ended up developing a bit of a structure on how I would take people through that. As an example of that, I don't know whether the reference makes sense to anyone, but there's if you Google like Jesus fish, it's this like very simple kind of I don't even know how to describe it, but like fish shape, but it's just like single line work. And that was the shape that they had to make in the dirt with their truck tire. And so that became the most effective thing that I could give people as a tangible takeaway to focus on. Even when I get out of the truck with you, just look at the dirt, have a look at the shape you made, how close to that are you, and then being able to give them cues depending on the shape of that, what they needed to correct. So that was, probably my first full kind of learning job. So I did that for about 6 months. And then before too long, I found myself in the office of the mine manager after applying for a permanent job. And he said to me, why do you deserve a permanent job in our mine? I was a contractor before that. And I looked at him and said, I'm not sure whether you remember this, but going back, a year and a half ago, you came in and talked to our class, and I asked you how I can become something more than a truck driver. You told me to be the best truck driver I could and then come back and see you. And that's what I'm doing now. And he laughed and he said, I actually do remember that. And he said, and based on that, he said, yep, you've got the job. So super, that was a very interesting 18 months. I learned so much. Really fast-tracked, I think, above what a lot of other people did in that situation. A typical permanent job took sort of 3 to 4 years. But like I said, I was working pretty much like double the time of most other people. So I think I really accelerated through that. Shortly after that, the person that I originally helped out in the training classroom back in my first 2 weeks, we'd stayed in contact over the sort of probably year and a half that had transpired between then. Every now and again, he'd call me as his IT support or presentation update support and asked me to come over and fix something for him, or he was having trouble with something. I think I ended up even doing his tax returns for him at some point for about 5 years or so there. So pretty much anything technology-wise, he got a new phone. I became the on-call support for him after that. And then at some point around then, he actually asked me to come back over to the training classroom, and they needed an extra set of hands. So they were bringing in a massive amount of people at that time, like 30-something people, sometimes 60 a fortnight. And they needed someone else in the classroom to help out and someone to help drive around, when they went out into the mine. So I did that, and that was kind of the start of now my L&D career. So I moved from that role of helping out to facilitating into updating training packages, training coordinator role, training superintendent role across multiple sites. Worked my way up, a bunch of different roles, a bunch of different parts of that sort of mining environment, and then got an opportunity to move from that company over to the current company I'm with. And I've been there about 6 years now in a more corporate-facing role. But over the last, say, 4 years, my team's expanded to take on the operational parts of the business as well. In this podcast, I'm not going to talk about the role I have, the company I work for, some of those things. Obviously, people can find that really easy through LinkedIn. But I want to keep this separate as my thing and not connected to, the company I work for or that role. So, it's been now, that was maybe 2013. I got my first sort of training role. So about 11 years or so now. And, I've learnt so much along the way. I was, very early into e-learning development, once again, through that sort of tech lens. Trying to understand how to do that. I think I picked up Storyline 1, maybe just as it was changing to Storyline 2 back when it was a PowerPoint plugin or extension, and have kind of been involved in all of those things all along the way. So I think I've had a pretty holistic exposure to L&D roles, from that sort of coaching, facilitating, content development, and technical content development, technical content writing sort of side of things, as well as then e-learning, et cetera, into some sort of mobile development, VR development stuff, just before I moved into the current company I'm with. So, my perspective on all that stuff has changed massively over the years. If I look back at my first e-learning course I made, I still remember it. I think that I was actually on pretty good track with it, but sort of got steered away from what I was doing to make it more corporate, more, plain and boring, maybe is the right way to say it. But yeah, my view on learning has changed significantly during that time. The way I've looked at evaluation, the way I've looked at sort of even what it is I do fundamentally has massively evolved. And I'm sure that will continue to evolve, and maybe coming back to sort of, the people I want to talk to through this podcast. I'm always looking for, where I can improve, where I can grow, who's going to really challenge my perspectives on things, and that's what, I'm really excited about. So that's a little bit about, I suppose, why I started this, how I got here, a little bit about myself for anyone that doesn't sort of know who I am. And yeah, then I suppose a little bit about just what to expect. So some of those points that I just talked about around technology, people, just curiosity in general. But I'm also, like, some of the books behind me are not just learning books, but sort of behavioral psych, human books as well. So I don't really know what direction this will go in. I don't know whether it will be pure learning stuff or not at this point. Like I said, I'm a human with skills that ended up applying them to learning. So there are other areas that I'm interested to explore, but we'll see whether this is the medium for doing that. So from here, I've already spoken to some really exciting people and people that I'm, really looking forward to having on as guests. At the moment, it will probably be rare for me to be sitting here doing this by myself. So I already have my first guest lined up, and really excited for that. So look forward to being able to share more, and really appreciate you listening in. And thanks for bearing with me on what will be episode 1. And hopefully they will all get easier and better from here. So thank you very much. I'm Greg, and talk to you soon. Bye.